Nottinghamshire, in the English East Midlands, was until the end of the 19th century part of the vast Archdiocese of York, and the Archbishops of York had a base in the county at a town called Southwell, also pronounced as it is spelt, Southwell. British people do like a good old argument about how to pronounce a place name. In 956, King Edwig had given the archbishops a manor in Southwell, and they built a palace, a useful stopping off point on the way south to London. The palace, which can still be seen, continued in use until the English Civil War. Beside the palace they founded, probably in the 11th century, a Minster church, which was staffed by a community of secular rather than monastic clergy. This was not an unusual thing for major bishops to do. The Archbishops of York had founded similar minsters at Ripon and Beverley in York, and the Bishop of Durham had one beside his palace at Howden. Several medieval Archbishops of York died in Southwell and were buried in the Minster. The present Southwell Minster, which dates from the 12th century onwards, has been since 1884 the cathedral of the Diocese of Southwell and Nottingham. The medieval Archbishops of York richly endowed the church, and it is a substantial building. The nave, the western towers, the crossing tower and transepts are all from the early 12th century, and they were constructed in the sturdy style that was usual for the Normans and were probably erected by Archbishop Thomas. The east end of the Minster church, the choir, is probably the work of Archbishop Walter de Grey in the 1230s and 1240s, and is early English in style, is of the first flowering of the Gothic style of architecture. Now, it isn't either of those parts of the building that I want to introduce you to in this video, but rather to a part of the building that was constructed in the later part of the 13th century, and that is the chapter house of the Minster, where the medieval Minster clergy met for their formal meetings. This octagonal structure is on the north side of the choir and was probably ordered to be built by Archbishop John de la Romaine in 1288. It is particularly well known for the beautiful sculpture that adorns it, with fine naturalistic foliage carving that are known as the Leaves of Southwell. The sculptures are very beautiful and absorbing. The chapter house is approached from the north choir aisle along a vestibule, and the first thing you see as you get to the end of that vestibule is the great portal or doorway to the chapter house, which gives you an immediate impression of what treasures might lie within. The mouldings of the arches of the doorway are carved with rich, naturalistic vine foliage. Had this sort of thing been attempted 30 or 40 years earlier, the foliage would have been stiff and formal, but there is no formality here. Before looking at the decoration within, let's appreciate the structure itself. Although the sculpture is informal, the architecture of the chapter house is very formal. The chapter house is octagonal, as many English structures with this purpose were, and it was conceived as a glass house with 6 windows to light the space. Again, had the building been constructed 30 or 40 years before, the great expanse of glass would not have been possible, and the walls would have been set with narrow, pointed lancet windows. But medieval masons were great innovators, and in the second half of the 13th century they invented things called mullions and window tracery that allowed them to create large windows with individual lights that could flood structures with lots of light. Originally the windows here were filled with stained glass that would have cast an ethereal glow into the space, but very little of that remains. Below the windows, the walls of the interior are decorated with a formal repeating pattern of wall arcading, creating individual compartments that provide seats for the clergy chapter of the Minster. The ceiling is a glorious rib vault of stone. The many ribs of the vault include subsidiary ribs that are called tiercerons that allow the masons to construct the vault in stone without a central pillar, which is not only innovative but unique for a stone vault in such a space in England. Now, I lay on the floor for a few minutes to appreciate the vault the last time I visited, and I think I amused a couple of other visitors who wandered in. This is a bit of a habit of mine, to lay down on floors in churches, as you get such a wonderful new perspective and a sense of being enveloped by the space. I do suggest you try being as nutty as I am and give it a bit of a go. So let's look at some of the sculptures that this space is famed for. They are primarily on the internal arcading, and this arcading consists of a series of individual compartments for each priest that are divided by shafts and are each topped with a trefoil arch within a triangular gable. The gables are decorated each side embellished with blousy leaves called crockets and topped with a leafy finial. The main decoration of the arcade is to be found on the capitals that top the shafts and the corbels that join the gables together, and also in the spandrels, which is the space between the top of the trefoil and the gable. The masons are the most inventive with their treatment of the capitals, which are all carved with naturalistic foliage, and the sculpture has an artist's eye as they are rendered with near perfection and accuracy of form. We have vine, hawthorn, maple, both ranunculus leaves and flowers, ivy, hop, potentilla, rose, bryony and oak. It has been suggested too that there are examples here of fig, of geranium, wormwood, bittersweet, cherry and blackthorn. All these are species that were either native to or were commonly grown in England in the 13th century. This sort of naturalism in sculpture was an innovation in England in this period and was without question influenced by French fashion. Where the French lent in art and design in this period, the English always quickly followed. As well as the attention to such naturalistic details, there's also a bit of playfulness to some of the carvings as well. In the spandrels there are a number of so-called green men, faces with leaves protruding from their mouths. The corbels consist of busts of people. We have kings and queens, nobles, priests and bishops. Some are clearly caricatures. It would take a long video to show all of them to you. We don't see all these sculptures as they were seen in 1290 when they were complete. Recent research has indicated that they were all originally painted. In fact, not only were the sculptures on the walls coloured, but the vaulting of the ceiling was coloured too. It must have been a mesmerising space to enter when all this sculpture was enriched with colour and the windows were filled with stained glass. The mixture of very formal architecture and informal decoration creates a particular magic to the chapter house at Southwell. As masons went into the 14th century and into the next phase of development of the Gothic style, often called the decorated style of Gothic architecture, such informal, playful decoration as we see at Southwell would become much more common. Southwell Chapter House, with its influential patrons, the archbishops, was one of the places that was setting the architectural and artistic trend in England in this period. Thanks very much for watching.